Welcome. In this class, we will talk about four important terms: monohybrid cross, dihybrid cross, F1 generation and F2 generation. Now, to put very simply, Mendel gave the law of inheritance. Now, when Mendel propounded the law of inheritance, he talked about the parent generation. Now, parent generation, as you could understand, is in very simple terms, the generation from which the offspring comes. So you have the parent generation, let's say, which has a trait of tall versus short, a pure tall trait and a pure short trait, where both the genes are tall and both the genes are short. Now when you have the F1 generation, it is a cross pollination. So cross pollination occurs within the two species that are there. Okay, so you have capital T, small t and small t. So all the generations that would come in this would be a hybrid generation, which would phenotypically represent tall trees, but the genetic composition would be tall and short. And this is what is the F1 generation derived from the parent generation. So this is the parent generation. The first offspring from the parent generation is the F1 generation, which is here, which is also known as the first filial generation. Now this cross that we are talking about is a monohybrid cross because we are just taking one trait into account. The square that is formed to understand this is what is known as Punnett Square. So Punnett Square is again important. Now, once you have the F1 trait that is there, from the F1 generation you have the F2 generation. F2 generation is a generation which is obtained by self-pollination. So it's self-pollination. So far in the F1 generation we saw cross-pollination, but in the F2 generation we have tall, short, tall and short trait that is there. Now what would be the resultant? The resultant would be very interesting. The resultant species would be that you have, obviously if we see onto the genes, you have one pure tall, one pure dwarf and two mix. So genotypically or genotype, if we say, would be 1:2:1 ratio, where 1 is pure tall, 2 are mixed hybrid and 1 is pure dwarf. But if we talk about phenotypic ratio, what it would be? Phenotype would be 3 species appear to me as tall and only 1 species appear to me as short. So it would be 3:1. Now this is the F2 generation, the second filial generation. It is a result of the self-pollination of F1 generation. Now here we also understand the law of segregation. Law of segregation, according to Mendel, states that you have two factors which control a characteristic and that separates during the time of gamete formation. So at the time of gamete formation, that separates, and then you have different gametes which reproduce differently under this. The second important thing is a dihybrid cross. Under dihybrid cross, what do you take? You take two variations. So let's say what Mendel took was round and wrinkled versus yellow and green. So seed was either round or wrinkled or yellow in color versus green in color. The F1 generation that came in was this. That was the result of the cross pollination of the parent generation. Now that was RY and RY. Now you have the F2 generation. So you have capital R, capital Y, small r, capital Y, capital R, small y and small r, small y. Now this has to be crossed. When this has to be crossed, what would happen? You would have the result that would be displayed here. Now this result would display in such a fashion that there would be only one species which would be wrinkled and green in color. There would be 3 species that would lie here which would be small y, and that is round bar. Okay, and there would be 3 species that would be small r, small r, small r, small r and small r, small r, that would be wrinkled but yellow in color. And the rest of all them would be round and yellow. So the phenotypic ratio would be 9:3:3:1. However, the genotypic ratio as in that case was 1:2:1. Here it would be elaborated further to 1:2:1. Then you would have 2:4:2 and then again 1:2:1. So many variations would be seen under the genotypic composition, where you would have one capital R, one small r, one capital Y. So there would be numerous different combinations that would be seen genotypically. But phenotypically what we would see is 9 plants which are yellow and round, 3 plants which are wrinkled and yellow, 3 plants which are round and green, and only 1 plant which is wrinkled and green. And this is an example of a dihybrid cross. So this was a very basic understanding of what Mendel tried to explain under the law of inheritance: the parent generation, the P generation, the first phylalial F1 generation, F2 generation, the second phylalial generation, the law of segregation. We will be talking about many interesting topics in the upcoming session, so stay tuned. Have a wonderful day.